Hi, my name is Matthew Ellis, and I have the pleasure today to introduce Jayson Otto. Jayson researched through the city archives the Grand Rapids Public School collection, which the archives acquired in 2015. Started as about 10 boxes and grew to about 100 boxes, and there was a ton of great information in there, some great photos. Jayson's program, Fresh Air, Thrift, Exercise, and Innocent Delight, is about school gardening programs in the progressive era of Grand Rapids. Jayson has lectured at Aquinas and GVSU, and he was the market manager for the Fulton Street Farmers Market. Please introduce Jayson Otto. Oh, yeah.
We good? Can you hear me? All right, good. Okay, thank you, Matt. Thanks for the archives for providing this opportunity to do this. I'm going to stick to my script because there's a difference between lecturing and speaking, and I might start lecturing. Since this talk is sponsored by the archives, I thought I'd begin with this recommendation correspondence to the City Council from Mayor George P. Tillma, who holds the distinction of having the shortest term of any Grand Rapids mayor because of the infamous charter revision of 1917. This correspondence serendipitously fell out of a stack of City Council supporting documents when I began chasing a lead about 10 years ago on the history of the Fulton Street Farmers Market. In it, Tillma outlines a garden plan to help alleviate the high cost of living in 1916 by cultivating vacant lots throughout the city. Since my focus at the time was the history of the Fulton Street Farmers Market, I scanned the document and I moved on. I was much more interested in the higher profile controversy between grocers and housewives, which led to the creation of the immensely successful but ill-fated Leonard Street Market. The Leonard Market was the first retail-only farmers market in Grand Rapids, providing leverage for two other markets in Grand Rapids, one being the Curtin Fulton Street Farmers Market. I have given other talks on that history, and I don't plan to spend any time on that here, yet I never forgot about Tillma's gardening plan. So in the next half hour or so, I'll take you through school gardening programs between 1900 and 1920 in Grand Rapids. Tillma's plan was put in place when there were already over 50 garden clubs established with an enrollment of over 1,000 pre-secondary children. This was before the war gardens made those numbers swell. These school gardens were the result of work by many citizens from diverse social organizations here in Grand Rapids on a county level and also on a state level. A large number of these civic workers were women. The reason I was looking in the box at the archives at the council minutes from that particular meeting was because of this woman here. According to the press, that night, Eva McCall Hamilton had, quote, whipped 5 aldermen who had resisted the idea of a farmer's market, as she was the chair of Mayor Tillma's Committee on Markets and one of 4 women appointed to the High Cost of Living Commission. Hamilton, who would go on to become Michigan's first female senator, cut her political teeth in the chambers of our local government promoting farmers markets by besting the city leaders with data that she had collected on markets throughout the country. She also promoted citywide gardening plans. This, however, was not very controversial, as it fit with the accepted roles for women at the time as protectors of the home and, by extension, protectors of the neighborhood. The title of my talk comes from a news article in 1914 promoting gardening programs. The reporter writes, "Whatever tends to develop on children the love of the soil and the understanding of nature in children is commendable. No activity known to man pays as large dividends as gardening in health, wealth, and happiness. Fresh air, thrift, exercise, and innocent delight fall to the lot of city children when they weed and hoe." Gardening was viewed as part of the domestic sphere and a powerful tool of idealism in the raising of children. Civic work around beautification, health, and, quote, innocent delight were deemed a natural expression of female roles during this time. In 1912, journalist Frederick J. Haskins, who operated what would be considered the Google of his time, it was a syndicated column that would answer any question from the world's largest information bureau in D.C., wrote a column on the work of women's clubs. In it, he described the shift from Dante and Browning to being and doing. as women's clubs moved out of the clubhouse and into the streets. He went on to explain why. The interest of club women in civic work, he says, is only a recognition of the fact that all work pertaining to the welfare of the community is an enlarged form of housekeeping and therefore of natural interest to women. Yeah. While Hamilton was reaching over the wall between the domestic and public spheres by pushing for markets which explicitly threatened male grocers, the gardening programs were a perfect place for women interested in the emerging idea of municipal housekeeping. Yet, the dominant role of women in urban agriculture persists to this day. So about 20 years ago, you think I could say anthropology since I teach it. Anthropologist Laura DeLynn recorded a salient comment by a woman while she was weeding with a community farm in Mason, Michigan. So she writes, "On her hands and knees in the midsummer sun, she had been weeding a bed of leeks and chatting with her neighbors about childhood experiences, family relationships, and personal lifestyle awakenings. When she sat down on the wood chip pathway, looked about, and asked in an apparent epiphany of insight, 'Is this a women's movement?'" So I'm not going to go into the academics of this question, but the rhetorical answer is yes, and it has been for quite a while. So this talk will trace the early history of these successful gardening programs with a special focus on the women that stepped up to combat multiple problems of the city by promoting urban gardening programs for children. So no talk on public urban gardening programs in the United States would be complete without mentioning the larger-than-life Mayor Hazen Pingree of Detroit. Pingree was a Civil War veteran that was known to sneak whiskey for friends out of a loose brick in his basement when his wife Frances was not looking. However, his greatest legacy in his short life may have been his wife's idea. There is evidence that Frances Gilbert Pingree, known to her friends as Fanny, pointed out the paradox of empty land and hungry people in Detroit during the Great Scare of 1893, when Michigan's unemployment rate sat at about 42%. To stave off hunger for Detroiters, Pingree developed a program where vacant lot owners could donate land for the unemployed to raise potatoes and other crops. Pingree's potato patches became a model that were carried out throughout the country. In Grand Rapids, Mayor E.B. Fuller promoted a vacant lot program and appointed woodcarver R.E. Van Bree to connect donated land with residents in 1894. According to some reports, 500 vacant lots were secured for gardening, mostly in the southern and eastern parts of the city. As to the number of residents using the land for gardening, I still haven't found those numbers, so it's a tough time period to find that stuff. The charity organization Society was made up of bankers, businessmen, and lawyers, such as George P. Wanty, who became a federal judge, and local probate judge Cyrus E. Perkins. In 1897, there was also an anti-poverty club formed by a handful of other businessmen, and they started their own vacant lot program in the Oakdale neighborhood. The district nurses also got into the swing of things in 1899, and they started providing lots on Granville Avenue. These programs came and went, however, as the economy got better, and however, their wives were part of gardening programs that lasted for at least 20 years. So Dr. Emma Nichols Wanty was a physician for 15 years and then stopped practicing when she married George P. Wanty in the 1880s. In 1907, she was voted onto the Board of Education in Grand Rapids, spent over 15 years there, and during that time promoted gardening programs. Della Perkins, along with being a founding member of the Art Museum, was also a founding member of the Civic Health and Beauty Committee of the Ladies Literary Club. By the turn of the century, women's clubs were shifting their focus from philosophy and art to civic engagement, and a wildly successful home gardening program for school children in Grand Rapids was a direct result of this committee. In the spring of 1904, the Civic Health and Beauty Committee began distributing flower seeds to 6th grade schools in outlying areas of Grand Rapids for students to plant at their homes over the summer as part of a city beautification effort. This committee was chaired by Dr. Francis Rutherford, who was the city-appointed physician in 1870 in Grand Rapids, the first in the United States. She was also a founding member of the Ladies Literary Club. The committee leveraged donations in the second year from the state government through local Congressman William Alden Smith, who used state funds for 18,000 flower and vegetable seeds to 8 schools the next year. For about 10 summers, this committee would distribute flower and vegetable seeds to about 20 schools, then send an entourage that usually included Drs. Wanty and Rutherford and a couple of cars to inspect the flower garden shows these schools would put together. They'd award cash prizes to the schools with the best displays. Some of the schools were sent to the West Michigan Fair to show their displays. Prizes were also awarded to the schools that would send the most letters in to the school superintendent. These essays, of which some were printed in the paper, give a unique glimpse into the living conditions of some of the families in Grand Rapids during this time of rapid industrialization and population growth. According to the press, the letters are sent in by teachers uncorrected, and the reading of them fills one with emotions of amusement and tenderness, as well as with thoughts that do often lie too deep for tears. One kid said, "I got some nasturtium seeds and also a package of morning glories too, of Dr. Rutherford and Mr. Martin. I planted about half of nasturtium seeds, and after 2 weeks, they began to shoot upward through the ground. They grew very fast, and after they were about 3 inches tall, I had to leave them, and I'm very sorry I had to. We had to move out of our place. I did plant more seeds at our new place, but the chickens ate them. So, this is my second misfortune, and it is still too late to plant more seeds. I think I would better wait until next spring and have a good garden then. And it may be, if I live as long as next spring, I'll write you another report of my flowers." I don't know if that's sad or funny. Yeah. Okay, so William H. Elson was a progressive educator, and he was our superintendent in Grand Rapids for 6 years. He was interested in promoting better schools for poorer working class neighborhoods. An important aspect of his tenure was manual training. He made a visit to Booker T. Washington in Tuskegee and also W.B. Du Bois in Alabama in 1904 and was impressed with what was going on there. He was determined to integrate more of the manual training into our own school curriculum. And he was also quoted in the Grand Rapids Press questioning why black teachers don't make as much salary as white teachers. So Elson apportioned money to put in gardens at a handful of schools around the city, mostly in working class neighborhoods. So this differed from the philosophy espoused by the work of the Ladies Literary Club, as theirs was based on home gardening work. So indeed, there were many experts on gardening that frowned upon shared gardens on school property. So I'm sure many of them were reading this bulletin put out by the USDA on school gardens. And this was put out in 1905, and it made a lot of suggestions based on what they were doing in D.C. And what they said was the right of ownership and a respect for property rights are more largely developed from the possession of individual gardens than in a community garden. The idea that what's mine is my own becomes very strongly developed with the natural sequence that such possessions must be properly protected and all rights concerned respected. On the other hand, a party interest in a community garden does not so empathetically develop the idea of individual responsibility. And each one has a tendency to care less for the plants which another has shared in producing, with the result that responsibility is shirked and there's a lack of interest with a consequent lack of industry. For this reason, in our work, from the very inception, the individual garden idea has been emphasized and strictly adhered to. Now, Elson wanted community gardens, so they had different ideas going on here. So Elson was only superintendent for 6 years before moving to Cleveland, where he served as their superintendent until 1912. As an aside, in 1909, he began writing books for grade school, and his most popular legacy is arguably the publishing of Elson Readers, which introduced the characters Dick and Jane, actually. So, now, he didn't write the later Dick and Jane books, but he introduced the characters. Yeah. While the Ladies Literary Club was promoting their gardens and flower shows, Elson established gardens on school properties with a focus on manual training and also food production. So he defended his work in the press, saying, "The work is not being done for the sport connected with the gardening, but for the sake of securing practical results, not so much in vegetables raised, but because of the experience the children will have gained. So 2nd Avenue School was in a working class neighborhood on the railroad tracks. So this is Granville Avenue right here, right? Wealthy Street right here. 2nd Avenue School is right here. So it's where Habitat for Humanity is right now, actually. So when this school was established in 1871, there was only one train going by. However, the train yards grew quickly along with the school, which ended up holding about 500 pupils by 1906, along with separate wooden structure for kindergarten. It was in a horrible location, with rumbling train yards and the smelly gasworks in its backyard. Eventually, the 2nd Avenue School, complete with, as described in an article in the Granville Avenue Record, a wooden fire escape. Yeah, think about that. Yeah. Was replaced with Franklin School in 1915 as part of a $1 million worth building development in only 4 years in the Granville Avenue area, actually. It's a lot of money back then. Principal Clara Ward reported on the situation at the old school in 1913. During the 19 years I have been at the 2nd Avenue School, conditions have been rapidly growing worse. Now the Pier Marquette has 6 tracks at the foot of the hill, with trains going back and forth all the time. At the little station below us, a record was kept of passing traffic, and it was found in 24 hours, 800 trains went by. 2/3 or more of the traffic is in the daytime, and it was estimated that trains went by at the rate of 1 every 5 minutes all day, sometimes a train every minute or so. So imagine teaching in that school, huh? So this is a picture of their garden that they actually created. It was published in one of the school journals. And this is a picture of the building back in, I can't remember, 30s, 20s? Remember? Matt found this for me. 30s, right? Somebody else they had begun using it as a more of an industrial use, because that's pretty much what it was good for anyways. It wasn't a very nice building, right? So Clara Ward, the principal, was active in promoting playgrounds on the school property also for the children in the neighborhood. Gardens and playgrounds both found their genesis during these years at the Glenwood Public Schools. The first public playground was put in place in Congress School in 1902. In 1903, quote, teeterboards, whirligigs, swings, horizontal bars, springboards, apparatus for jumps, and all sorts of things were split between 2nd Avenue School and Union High School through city council appropriations. There was an explosion of interest in exercise for urban children across the nation during this period, and Grand Rapids was no exception. Gardens and playgrounds were both places where children could go during the summer months for wholesome recreation. Placing them at schools had the advantage of supervision during downtime. So, for example, the playground implements that were put at the Bissell House were torn apart in the winter of 1902 by local boys to burn for heating their homes. Putting playgrounds at public schools meant eyes were on them during the winter months. On the flip side, having students tend gardens during the summer made sure there were positive activities on school grounds over break. By 1910, there was a playground commission in place in Grand Rapids, which worked to improve the city parks and schools, opening social centers like the Garfield Lodge, shown here. The vice president of this commission was Clara Wheeler. Wheeler was an instructor at the kindergarten training school, where she would eventually become director after the passing of her mentor, Lucretia Treat. Treat was one of the earliest proponents of school gardens, urging support at a meeting of the Grand Rapids Horticultural Society in 1903. The president of this society and the Playground Commission was Charles W. Garfield. Charles W. Garfield needs no introduction to anyone that has a cursory knowledge of Grand Rapids history. However, his tenure as a teacher in Paris Township tends to not get mentioned very often. Indeed, I was not aware of this until I found this disciplinary report in the archives. It is no wonder, then, that he was a proponent of school gardens from the beginning, as he not only had an affinity to gardening as a professional horticulturalist, but he also spent time teaching children as a teenager. Garfield's urban gardening support went all the way back to being part of the Charity Organization Society's Vacant Lot Gardens Committee in 1894. He also would show up at some of the Ladies' Literary Club meetings to commend the Health and Beauty Committee on their work and also ask if they would need any assistance. Garfield, president of the Grand Rapids Savings Bank, was active in school gardening for at least 20 years, leveraging support from many places, including other bankers who would be instrumental in the war garden movement in Grand Rapids. However, as is the theme here, there is a woman connected to Garfield who tends to have been left in the annals of history. Garfield Park was first called Garfield Fletcher Playground because the first parcels of the land were donated by Charles and his cousin, widower Julia Fletcher. Julia Fletcher's late husband was the law partner of aforementioned school board member Dr. Emma Nichols Wanty's husband. In 1911, Julia Fletcher and Emma Wanty donated a 23-acre farm to the Grand Rapids Public Schools to be used as a farm for homeless, neglected, or delinquent boys. The land was located east of Fuller and north of the Grand Trunk Railroad, had a farmhouse which was used to house students. The project was plagued with legal issues as the property sat outside the city limits. So it was, if you go, well, you know, oh, geez. So right in there, you bring that out. So it was up here. Shell gas station's right there, right now. Possibly where this dairy farm was right here. I'm not exactly sure. By 1917, yeah, this is Michigan Avenue, or Mission Street right here. Yeah. By 1917, the plan was to make the farm a girls' home through the Public Welfare Department, but it was also being fought by the city lawyers. City manager Cummins stated that he is, quote, ready to fight to the last ditch to take advantage of the Fletcher-Wanty offer. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to put enough time into figuring this one out, so that's where it sits. However, it brings up a shift in public gardening programs, which happened when Elson moved to Cleveland. Elson's replacement was William Greason. Greason was very interested in rehabilitating, quote, backward, subnormal, and defective children. Yeah. He proposed many unique ideas to integrate slower learners with their cohorts, including year-round education in some of the schools, and directing some of these students toward manual trading, including agriculture. Incidentally, he may have been influenced by a woman from Cleveland. So this Cleveland connection in Grand Rapids School gardening program went for quite a while. The Ladies Literary Club credited a talk by Howard Strong of Cleveland as the impetus for them to start. They also had private meetings with an E.W. Haynes, who was president of the Home Garden Association in Cleveland. In 1904, his successor was Louise Klein Miller, who became a nationally recognized expert on school gardens, who wrote this book here, and traveled to Grand Rapids many times to look at our gardens and also have talks at the schools. She stated in one of her talks that the school garden work, which has resulted in the Back to the Backyard movement, has been established in Cleveland for more than 10 years. Juvenile delinquency has been greatly decreased owing to the interest and occupation afforded by the home and school gardens. Defective children have been materially helped, and many of the older boys and girls have become farmers' assistants and are doing successful work on farms. The school gardens are the basis of nature study, she said. So these pictures here are actually from the 20s, obviously, because the car. Diamond School had a really active nature study. Found these slides in the archives. I'd like to actually explore them more. But she continues, from the cultivation of flowers and vegetables, the children are instructed in the great principles of reproduction as applied to plant life. And from this, the subject of eugenics is tactfully approached. The subject of better flowers and better vegetables easily leads to the subject of better people. So here's where the gardening program and sociological work in general takes a dark turn in the Progressive era. Such sentiment was echoed 10 years earlier by kindergarten trainer leader Lucretia Treat in the previously aforementioned meeting with the GR Horticultural Society, where she argued that, quote, students can learn, quote, periods in development of the human race while raising flowers and vegetables. Civic work of the Progressive era is colored with the scientific racism of the time, and Grand Rapids was not immune. There were many different ethnic groups, each placed on a hierarchy of social evolution, with some considered to be more civilized than others, based mainly on the color of their skin. One Greek resident in the press in Grand Rapids in 1909 said, "It is an injustice to class the Syrians and the Greeks with the Chinese," he said. "The Chinese are Mongolians, and this is not true with the Syrians. They are Caucasians and not yellow." Right. Immigrant groups from Europe had a distinct advantage to all other people based on skin color, and the first model garden in Grand Rapids, used to show our successful program throughout the nation, was not surprisingly from a Dutch immigrant neighborhood, so Oakland School, as Dutch immigrants were tended to be described as, quote, sturdy or thrifty, right? So Oakdale School's principal was Frances Van Buren. Van Buren was the daughter of civically engaged Grand Rapids pioneer and dairy owner Osinus Van Buren. Her sisters Phyla and Agnes were both teachers in the public schools throughout the last quarter of the 19th century and into the 20th. Phyla, her sister up here, was actually an active suffragist who was chosen to carry Michigan's 1924 vote to Washington, D.C., where she met with President Coolidge 2 weeks before she passed away, actually. Or 3 weeks, I'm sorry, before she passed away. Miss Van Buren followed in her father and older sister's footsteps, dedicating her entire life to the education of Grand Rapids youth, and was on innumerable boards and committees throughout her life. The Oakdale Gardens had a 90-foot square space, of which half was a community garden for the Mothers Club to raise flowers for the sick in the neighborhood. The other half was divided into plots for each room in the school. A second 40 by 60 space was used for about 60 individuals to have their own plots. A supervisor, Grace Watson, was hired to oversee the garden throughout the summer. The Oakdale Gardens perennially won the garden contest and were featured multiple times at the West Michigan Fair. Van Buren wrote about the successes of the Oakdale Gardens in a variety of educational journals, traveled to conferences showing slides of the work being done. One paper stated that her work, quote, or the newspaper stated that her work, quote, set an example of thrifty enterprises likely to follow in neighboring homes on other lines. So the influence of the idea goes forth to other cities and states. So by 1914, Superintendent Greason reported that 17 schools had their own gardens. These gardens were supported by the Board of Education, the Grand Rapids Recreation Department, and also by the Park Board. While Oakdale was a model garden, some of the other gardens were aimed at improving poorer sections of the city. South Division School, in contrast to the homogeneous makeup of Oakdale, or stood in contrast to the homogeneous makeup of Oakdale. So to give an idea of the ethnic makeup of this school, 25 of the students were once paraded in front of an Americanization graduation ceremony, singing Yankee Doodle, to show the, quote, cosmopolitan character of American citizenship. So the group included Lebanese, Italian, French, English, and 2 African-American children. Gardening at these schools may have been focused on helping to remedy the, quote, the immigrant problem, or maybe the Negro question, which was in the paper all the time, both of them. The paper reported that one principal of a building in which there are many children of foreign parentage says that while it was difficult to keep the school laws unmolested, the children now take personal pride in its appearance and have even contributed pennies to buy flowers, besides planting and cultivating the seeds and bulbs secured through the Committee on Civic Health and Beauty. Indeed, a professor from Western State Normal School had told Grand Rapids teachers in reference to assimilating immigrant children, a little garden plot, he said, would solve the question of connecting the school to the home. For the child would usually plant a home plot, which the teacher would visit occasionally, forming an easy entrance into cooperation with the parents. It would teach the child to love his own property and thus respect others, and indirectly to love and protect his native country. Another reporter at South Division School talked to some African-American students. He said he had no good soil in his own yard in which to plant the seeds, so he borrowed some from the next-door neighbor. The corn grown under these difficulties was one of the finest stalks seen at any of the schools. Many of the child gardeners worked under discouraging difficulties and were consequently proud of their success. One boy, when asked why he had no flowers or vegetables, looked genuinely disappointed and, lapsing from schoolroom English to street jargon, said, "Aw, 'tain't no use. Every time I tried to raise a garden, the things just begin to grow and we has to move. I'm awful sorry, lady, but 'tain't no use." So by 1915, the Health and Beauty Committee of the Ladies Literary Club was under the leadership of Anna McKnight. Her husband, a lawyer and lumber baron, was the head of the Association of Commerce, and she merged her committee with the organization to start a cleaner, greener Grand Rapids campaign. This iteration of the Ladies Literary Club school gardening clubs was extremely popular in the Herald, with full-page spreads of pictures of kids doing their school gardening stuff. It was reported that 3,000 students participated. McKnight's status is evidenced by this photo of her with President Taft, right here, outside the Ladies Literary Club. The most interesting person of this movement, however, was a stubborn lady that lived between two railroad tracks on Shelby Street. Margaret Raditz, shown here, spent a lot of time heading to City Hall to complain about the lack of sanitation and lighting on her street. The Herald stated, "When the city authorities were tardy in sending down men to cut the weeds which grow in profusion and riot about her home and in the street, she herself would march sturdily out to the offending spots, and with her sigh hack and hew until the entire patch lay conquered before her." Raditz started gardens all around her home and encouraged the local children to work with her. She pushed the city council to put Shelby through to division during this time, which did happen eventually. But ironically, where her street is no longer exists, so was the end of what they called her Happy Hollow that she had between the railroad tracks right there. So by 1916, gardening programs shifted their focus away from beautification and back to food production. This was because of massive rises in food costs caused by global inflation. Food prices in some cases tripled between 1915 and 1920. This was exacerbated by the war in Europe. The farmers markets that were started in Grand Rapids during this period were a direct reaction of these food prices. The school gardening programs during this time went gangbuster, and they expanded their operations to food preservation through canning cooperatives. The mothers' clubs at the schools were the backbone of this movement. So the mothers' clubs would eventually be the PTA down the road. Eventually, there was a garden leader chosen from a mothers' club in each district who would oversee tracking students' progress and report to a central gardening supervisor. A lot of data was collected on the Boys and Girls Gardens clubs while this system was in place. Mothers' clubs were excited about the work being done with gardens. Some, however, were suspicious of the wealthy club women who had come talk to them about food conservation. For example, one woman reacted to Eva Hamilton. "I enjoyed Mrs. Hulst's talk on school gardens very much, but I took exception to Mrs. Hamilton's paper on the wastefulness of the working man's wife. Perhaps that was not the title of her paper, but it dwelt entirely on that and on the saving of children. It is almost laughable to hear one who knows nothing about poverty tell the poor how they should save. Economy is one thing, but it takes money to economize." The Michigan Agricultural College had received fundings through the USDA and sent Edward C. Lindeman to Grand Rapids in 1915 to create boys and girls gardening clubs with the Kent County Agriculturalists and also the Old National Bank. The goal of these clubs was to create a duplicable model which could be used to teach other mid-sized cities. They also hired Joseph Machatka as city gardening supervisor. By the end of the 1915 season, Lindeman had organized 22 clubs with 581 children, and adult advisory boards were put in place in each neighborhood. Interesting, though, when you dig into the expenses, you find that Grace Watson was the highest paid employee, even though she was the Oakdale Gardens supervisor and not the city supervisor. Further investigation indicates that she visited every single garden plot over the summer for inspections. Grace Watson was hired on as the city garden supervisor by the city of Grand Rapids after this season. When the United States entered the war and gardening became a patriotic duty, she had the resources and the network to help make Grand Rapids one of the leaders in war garden production and preservation. The Boys and Girls Clubs exploded during this period, with every school in the city participating in one way or another, and upwards of 4,000 students cultivating their own plots. Watson organized a garden day at Garfield Fletcher Park, inviting speakers from all over the state to celebrate, including civic reformer Carolyn Bartlett Crane, who came as representative of the Michigan National Defense Council. Bartlett Crane was very interested in boosting the participation of the Grand Rapids Women's Committee of the Council on National Defense in the lines of food production and preservation. Hundreds of children paraded around the park, holding banners that read "Soldiers of the Soil" and "We're not slackers." Guest speakers from around the state came to congratulate the children on their work, and a representative from the Michigan State College Extension judged the children's harvest, offering prizes. The event was even filmed to be shown later at a local theater with close-ups of local celebrities, including Mayor Fuller, who had spoken at the first ever opening day at the Leonard Street Market a couple weeks earlier. So many people showed up that there was not enough room for everyone to sit down for lunch. Garden Day brought out a whimsical flair from the mayor, as evidenced in his invitation. "Mary, Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow?" Mary and all others are invited to Garfield Park Saturday, July 21st. Experts will show how to eliminate insects by spraying, how to catch moles and other four-legged animals that take what belongs to you, and how to make your garden productive. Other experts will show you how to eat what you can and can what you can't. Prizes will be given for the best samples. The Furniture City Band will play and everyone will sing patriotic songs. Celebrated national speakers, including ex-Governor W.N. Ferris, will be present. Clay H. Hollister, president of the Old National Bank, and another gentleman, too modest to have his name mentioned, will tell you in 5 minutes how little they know about gardening. Bring your lunch and spend the day. Come in the afternoon anyway. Good time for all. Philo C. Fuller, Mayor. So according to some national calculations, Grand Rapids was one of the top 6 producers of war garden crops in the United States, following Denver, Minneapolis, Indianapolis, D.C., and L.A. About $1 million in war garden crops were counted in 1918. Local calculations put Grand Rapids higher, of course. This article put the number well over $1 million in garden supplies, or garden produce. Garden networks started popping up all over the city for children and adults alike. The Tilma plan was still in place, where people could phone the comptroller to request vacant land that was offered. Other schemes were through banks. Walter Murphy, the man pictured here, was one of the many, quote, garden men that the local banks hired to help apportion vacant lots of to people in the city, and also find funding through government and private donations. All the banks in town had a garden man. The Old National Bank also hired a woman from the Michigan Agricultural Extension. So Emily Castle was the county canning supervisor. Castle, a native of Mount Clemens, Michigan, conducted over 50 canning demonstrations for over 4,000 women in 1917. Stirring up patriotic foment and woman power in the local paper, she writes, "Surely the instances are rare when any woman can feel that there is anything more important to her than knowing how to increase the food supply. Whatever may be a woman's interest in life, surely she has none greater than life itself, and food means life. Our nation is crying, food, more food, more food. Let it not be said that the women of Grand Rapids and Kent County failed in the seemingly small things which were needed to accomplish the great things which America needs this year." Canning centers popped up at the schools throughout the city, where young people could process their crops for free, and neighbors could can for a small fee to cover the jars and the gas. In 1917, Boys and Girls Clubs canned a total of $5,000 worth of fruits and vegetables. One farmer commented that the Grand Rapids would go hungry if it were not for what boys and girls raised in their gardens, that the farmer with scarcity of labor and big wages demanded would not bother with a garden. So the garden clubs continued their popularity into the 1920s. However, they drop out of school reports around 1922. Garfield fought the school board for funding, but the school board decided that they weren't as important anymore now that the war was over, and the economy started balancing itself out. There's evidence, though, that the Kent Garden Club may have continued funding some of the gardening contests in the vacancy left by the Ladies Literary Club, who quit their health and beauty committee around that time also. So it would be very interesting I guess the Kent Garden Club just donated some of their stuff to the library here, so it'd be very interesting to go through that and continue this story to now, because they still exist. And to bring it to today now, too, if you go to where 2nd Avenue School is, Habitat for Humanity has their offices there, and behind it is a learning garden, and that learning garden is exactly where the 2nd Avenue Garden was. So there you go. Yeah. Thank you.
Any questions for Jayson?
The headline with the great garden.
Yes.
The great gardener. Long may he live.
Well,
Did
of course.
anyone notice that?
He included she. Actually. If you notice, there was a picture of a woman there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like, man was women back then, too. Anthropology was the study of man until about 30 years ago. Yeah.
Jayson, you've done a lot of work throughout that period on women and involved in city government.
Yes.
And would you say that when, I believe there was a new state constitution put in effect in 1907, which meant that women suffragists could no longer circulate petitions for referenda. And that's when they started getting more involved, trying to get committee appointments.
Yeah.
Did that boost the school gardens movement, as far as you know? That was a big shift in what women were involved in.
I don't think so. From what I've found, they were still, in Grand Rapids at least, I don't see much activity from a government perspective where they actually were doing things at the council chambers until much later than that. But during that time period, they were very vocal about letting people like the Association of Commerce know that they were there. So the lady that took over the Health and Beauty Committee, I can't remember when it was right about that time, after Van Buren, she put a public letter in the newspaper letting the Association of Commerce, they had a new president also, know that, yes, we are doing what you say you're doing. Literally, I mean, it was veiled, but it was very thinly veiled. Of like, by the way, we're over here doing this. Because they started a beauty, right before McKnight did her thing with them, they had started some sort of beauty committee, and the women were like, like, that's our thing. So, not in the public, as in, I would say, government sphere, but in the business world, for sure. But yeah. As far as I know, the High Cost of Living Commission maybe, I don't know for sure, but it might be the first time that there were women that were actually appointed by the mayor to do things. I don't know, but I've been looking, and yeah. So, yeah. Anyone else?
Okay, thank you, Jayson.
Yeah, thanks.